In the grand halls of Valdoria's ancient palace, where golden chandeliers have witnessed 3 centuries of royal secrets, a single document would shatter everything. King Edmund VII, beloved by his people and respected across nations, stood before ornate mirrors that had reflected the faces of countless monarchs before him. But, tonight, those same mirrors would witness something unprecedented in the kingdom's history. The parchment in his weathered hands bore the royal seal, its crimson wax still warm. With trembling fingers, he signed his name to words that would strip his beloved wife, Queen Isabel, of every title, privilege, and power she had held for nearly 2 decades. The woman who had stood beside him through political storms, public scandals, and personal tragedies would wake tomorrow morning to find herself cast out from the very throne she had helped him secure. What could drive a king who had publicly declared his love for his queen to such drastic action? What dark secrets had surfaced in the velvet-draped corridors of power? As the grandfather clock struck midnight in the royal chambers, King Edmund sealed not just his wife's fate, but the destiny of an entire kingdom that would soon learn that even the most powerful love stories can crumble when the crown itself is at stake. This is the story of how the most trusted marriage in Valdoria's royal history became its greatest scandal, and how one night's decision would echo through the marble halls of power, changing the very foundation of a monarchy that had stood unshaken for generations. The autumn morning mist clung to the towers of Castle Valdoria like a shroud of secrecy, and Queen Isabel Montclair stood at the window of her private chambers, unaware that this would be her last day wearing the crown. The ornate timepiece on her mahogany desk chimed 7 times, marking the beginning of what she believed would be another routine day in her 18-year reign as queen consort of the prosperous kingdom of Valdoria. Isabel adjusted the pearl necklace that had belonged to her predecessor, Queen Victoria Valdoria, and smoothed the silk fabric of her morning dress. At 47, she retained the grace and dignity that had first caught King Edmund's attention at a diplomatic gathering in neighboring Astoria nearly 20 years ago. Her auburn hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was pulled back in an elegant chignon that showcased the sapphire earrings gifted to her on their 10th wedding anniversary. The kingdom of Valdoria had flourished under their joint leadership. Edmund, with his keen political mind and natural charisma, handled foreign affairs and military matters, while Isabel had become the beloved champion of education reform and charitable organizations. Their marriage had been more than a union of 2 people, it had been a partnership that strengthened the monarchy and brought stability to their realm of 12 million citizens. As she prepared for her morning briefing with Lord Chancellor Frederick Ashworth, Isabel reflected on the previous evening's state dinner with the ambassadors from the Eastern Trade Consortium. The negotiations had gone smoothly, and Edmund had seemed pleased with the preliminary agreements they had secured for Valdoria's expanding textile industry. There had been no indication of the storm that was about to break over their seemingly unshakable kingdom. Lady Margaret Thornfield, Isabel's private secretary and closest confidant, entered the chamber carrying a silver tray with the morning correspondence. Margaret had served in the royal household for 12 years, having started as a junior assistant before earning Isabel's trust and friendship. Her loyalty was absolute, and her discretion was legendary among the palace staff. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, setting the tray on the polished walnut desk, "the morning reports from the various ministries, and your schedule for the day. The Foundation Board meeting has been moved to 2 o'clock to accommodate Minister Davidson's change in travel plans." Isabel nodded, settling into her leather chair to review the documents. The Children's Education Foundation had been her pet project since becoming queen, and, under her guidance, literacy rates in Valdoria had increased by 37%. She was particularly excited about the new rural school initiative that would bring quality education to the kingdom's remote villages. "Has His Majesty left for his morning ride?" Isabel inquired, noticing that Edmund's usual morning visit to her chambers had not occurred. For 18 years, they had maintained the tradition of sharing coffee and discussing the day's agenda before beginning their royal duties. Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening around her eyes that Isabel, despite their close relationship, failed to notice. "His Majesty requested that you join him in the blue drawing room at 9 o'clock, Your Majesty. He asked that you come alone, without your usual retinue of advisors." The blue drawing room was traditionally used for private family discussions or sensitive diplomatic meetings. Isabel assumed Edmund wanted to discuss the upcoming visit from the Prince of Meridia, who was expected to arrive the following week with a proposal for a military alliance. The geopolitical landscape had been shifting lately, with several smaller kingdoms forming new partnerships, and Valdoria needed to maintain its strategic position. After finishing her correspondence and approving 3 new appointments to the Royal Arts Council, Isabel made her way through the palace's familiar corridors toward the blue drawing room. The walls were lined with portraits of previous Valdorian monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress through the marble hallways. Generations of royal history surrounded her, and she took comfort in being part of this continuing legacy. The palace staff she encountered along the way offered their usual respectful bows and warm smiles. Head butler William Sterling, who had served the royal family for 30 years, greeted her with his customary dignity. The young housemaids curtsied as she passed, and the palace guards stood at attention. Everything appeared normal, which made what was about to unfold even more shocking. As she approached the blue drawing room, Isabel noticed Lord Chancellor Ashworth emerging from the room with an expression she had never seen before. His usually composed demeanor seemed shaken, and he avoided making direct eye contact with her. Frederick Ashworth had been Edmund's most trusted advisor for over a decade, and seeing him in such a state sent the first ripple of unease through Isabel's consciousness. "Lord Chancellor," she called softly, hoping to understand what had transpired in the room before her arrival. "Your Majesty," he responded, his voice strained. "His Majesty is waiting for you." He bowed quickly and hurried away down the corridor, leaving Isabel with a growing sense that something significant was about to occur. She paused at the heavy oak doors of the blue drawing room, adorned with intricate carvings depicting scenes from Valdorian mythology. Behind these doors, countless important decisions had been made that shaped the kingdom's destiny. Taking a deep breath, she knocked gently and heard Edmund's familiar voice bid her enter. The room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn across the tall windows that normally flooded the space with natural light. Edmund stood with his back to her, facing the massive fireplace where a small fire crackled despite the mild autumn weather. He wore his formal dark blue military uniform, the one reserved for state occasions and serious ceremonial events. The sight of him in such formal attire during what she had assumed would be a casual morning meeting sent another wave of concern through her mind. "Edmund," she said softly, closing the door behind her. "Margaret said you wanted to speak with me privately. Is everything all right with the Meridian negotiations?" King Edmund VII turned slowly to face his wife, and Isabel was struck immediately by the change in his appearance. His usually bright eyes seemed dulled, and deep lines of stress marked his face in ways she had not noticed the previous evening. His thick brown hair, graying at the temples, appeared disheveled despite his otherwise impeccable appearance. Most alarming was his posture. The confident bearing that had made him such an effective leader seemed diminished. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing toward one of the blue velvet chairs arranged near the fireplace. His voice carried an unfamiliar formal tone that sent a chill through Isabel's heart. She remained standing, her instincts warning her that sitting would put her at a disadvantage for whatever was about to unfold. "Edmund, you're frightening me. What has happened? Is it news from the border provinces? Has there been an incident with our neighbors?" Edmund moved to his desk and picked up a manila folder that Isabel had not noticed when she entered the room. The folder appeared thick, filled with documents, photographs, and what looked like official reports. His hands trembled slightly as he held it, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Isabel, I have received information that changes everything between us. Information that changes everything about your position in this kingdom." The formal use of her name, rather than the affectionate nicknames he had used for nearly 2 decades, struck her like a physical blow. She gripped the back of the chair she had refused to sit in, her knuckles turning white as she fought to maintain her composure. "What kind of information?" she managed to ask, though part of her mind was already racing through possibilities, searching for anything in her past that could justify the gravity of Edmund's demeanor. Edmund opened the folder and removed several photographs, placing them face down on the coffee table between them. "These were delivered to me yesterday evening by Lord Intelligence Minister Harrison, along with a comprehensive report that took 3 months to compile." Isabel's mind flashed to the previous evening. Edmund had seemed normal during the state dinner, engaging with the ambassadors, sharing private jokes with her during brief moments between courses. If he had received such devastating information, he had hidden his reaction completely. The realization that he had been acting normally while harboring such earth-shattering knowledge made her feel naive and vulnerable. 3 months, she repeated, her voice barely audible. You've been investigating me for 3 months? Not investigating you specifically, Edmund clarified, though his words offered little comfort. We were investigating irregularities in several royal charities and foundations. Your name came up in connection with financial discrepancies that demanded further examination. The Children's Education Foundation. Isabel's heart began to race as she realized her life's work, the projects that had brought her the greatest pride and satisfaction, were somehow at the center of this crisis. She had personally overseen every major decision related to the foundation, had signed every significant expenditure authorization, and had trusted her appointed board members to handle the day-to-day operations with integrity. The foundation has been audited yearly, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Every financial report has been transparent and approved by the Royal Accounting Office. Edmund's expression grew even more grave as he turned over the first photograph. It showed Isabel at a charity gala 3 years earlier, standing beside Marcus Pemberton, the foundation's chief financial officer, and Isabella Carstairs, a prominent donor who had contributed significantly to the Rural Education Initiative. Do you remember this evening? Edmund asked, his finger pointing to the photograph. Of course, Isabel replied, confusion mixing with her growing fear. It was the annual fundraising gala for the Rural Schools Project. We raised over 2 million gold sovereigns that night. According to the financial records we've uncovered, less than half of that money ever reached the schools, Edmund said, his words falling like hammers on her heart. The rest was diverted through a complex series of shell companies and false contracts. Isabel stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process the implications of what Edmund was revealing. Marcus Pemberton had been her trusted financial officer for 6 years. She had personally recommended him for the position after he had demonstrated exceptional competence in managing charitable funds for the Royal Arts Council. Isabella Carstairs was from one of Valdoria's most respected noble families, known for their philanthropic work across 3 generations. That's impossible, she whispered, though even as she spoke, she could hear the doubt creeping into her own voice. Marcus provides me with detailed reports every month. I've visited the schools personally. I've seen the new buildings, met the teachers we've funded. Edmund turned over another photograph, this one showing Isabel signing a document at her desk in the royal offices. The date stamp indicated it was from 8 months earlier, during the authorization process for the latest round of rural school construction. This document, Edmund said, producing a copy from his folder, authorized the transfer of 800,000 gold sovereigns to Pemberton Construction Limited for the building of 6 new schools in the northern provinces. Isabel remembered signing the document clearly. She had been excited about the project, which would bring education to children in some of Valdoria's most remote areas. Yes, I signed that authorization. The schools were completed on schedule and within budget. Pemberton Construction Limited is a company owned entirely by Marcus Pemberton's brother, Edmund revealed. The schools were built, but at a fraction of the authorized cost. The remaining funds were transferred to accounts in neighboring kingdoms, beyond our financial investigators' immediate reach. The room seemed to spin around Isabel as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. She was not just the victim of embezzlement, her signature was on the documents that had authorized the theft of funds intended for the kingdom's most disadvantaged children. Whether she had known about the fraud or not, her responsibility as the Foundation's royal patron made her culpable in the eyes of the law and, more importantly, in the eyes of their people. How much? She asked, dreading the answer. Edmund consulted another document from his folder. Over the past 6 years, approximately 4.2 million gold sovereigns have been diverted from various royal charitable initiatives under your supervision. The scheme was sophisticated and involved multiple conspirators, including several individuals you personally appointed to positions of trust. The magnitude of the theft was staggering. 4.2 million gold sovereigns represented nearly 10% of Valdoria's annual royal budget. It was enough money to fund the kingdom's entire educational system for 2 years, or to provide emergency relief for natural disasters across multiple provinces. The thought that such a massive sum had been stolen under her watch, using her authority and trust, made her feel physically ill. Edmund, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of this fraud. I trusted the people I appointed. I believed in their integrity and competence." King Edmund's expression remained unchanged, though she could see the pain in his eyes. "The problem, Isabel, is not whether you knew. The problem is that your signature is on dozens of authorization documents, your personal seal approved the appointment of the conspirators, and your public endorsement gave these individuals the credibility they needed to execute their scheme." He moved to the window and pulled back the curtains, allowing the morning sunlight to flood the room. The sudden brightness felt harsh and unforgiving, much like the reality that was crashing down around Isabel's carefully constructed world. "The people of Valdoria trusted you with their children's futures," Edmund continued, his voice gaining strength as he seemed to find resolve in his decision. "Noble families donated their wealth to your causes because they believed in your leadership and integrity. You have been the public face of charitable giving in this kingdom for 18 years. Isabel sank into the chair she had earlier refused, her legs no longer able to support her weight. The blue velvet felt soft against her trembling hands as she gripped the armrests, trying to anchor herself in a world that suddenly seemed to be crumbling beneath her feet. "What does this mean?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Edmund returned to his desk and retrieved another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Kingdom of Valdoria. The Royal Council met in emergency session last night after reviewing Lord Harrison's complete report. They have unanimously voted to recommend that you be stripped of all royal titles, privileges, and authority pending a full criminal investigation. The words hit Isabel like physical blows. In the space of one conversation, her entire life's work, her position, her identity, and her future had been destroyed. She thought of the children in the rural schools who would now doubt whether their education had been funded through stolen money. She thought of the donors who had trusted her with their charitable contributions. Most painfully, she thought of the people of Valdoria who had looked up to her as a symbol of integrity and compassion. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What do you recommend, Edmund?" The king walked to where his wife sat, and, for a moment, his formal composure cracked. She could see the husband she had loved for 20 years struggling with the monarch who had sworn to protect and serve his kingdom above all personal considerations. "I have to put the crown above my heart, Isabel. I have to put Valdoria above everything else, even above us." When he spoke again, his voice carried the full authority of his office. "By royal decree, effective immediately, you are hereby stripped of the title Queen Consort of Valdoria, removed from all official duties and ceremonial functions, and barred from accessing royal funds or properties pending the completion of a full investigation into your involvement in these financial crimes." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the window, Isabel could hear the normal sounds of the palace beginning its daily routines, servants preparing for the morning shift changes, horses being led to the stables, the distant sound of the royal guard conducting their training exercises. Life was continuing normally for everyone except her. "When?" she asked. "The decree was signed at midnight last night," Edmund replied. "You have until sunset today to gather your personal belongings and leave the palace. You will be provided with a modest allowance for basic living expenses, but all other royal privileges are revoked immediately." Isabel looked around the blue drawing room, taking in details she had never noticed before, the intricate patterns in the wallpaper, the way the morning light created shadows across the Persian rug, the slight chip in the marble mantelpiece that spoke of centuries of history. This room, like every other space in the palace, would no longer be part of her world after today. "May I ask where I am expected to go?" "Your sister Victoria has offered to let you stay at her estate in the countryside while the investigation proceeds. It will provide you with privacy and distance from the public attention this situation will undoubtedly generate." Victoria Montclair lived 3 hours away from the capital in a modest manor house surrounded by farmland. It was a peaceful place where Isabel had spent happy childhood summers, but the thought of returning there under these circumstances felt like a form of exile. As she rose from the chair, Isabel realized that she was no longer Queen Isabel of Valdoria. She was simply Isabel Montclair, a woman whose life had been irrevocably changed by the actions of people she had trusted and decisions she had made in good faith. The weight of the crown she would never wear again seemed to press down on her shoulders as she prepared to leave the room where her royal life had effectively ended. The news of Queen Isabel's downfall spread through the kingdom of Valdoria like wildfire across dry grassland. By noon on the day of her banishment, every newspaper in the capital city of Aurelius was running special editions with headlines that screamed betrayal, corruption, and the fall of a beloved royal figure. The kingdom's citizens, who had awakened that morning believing in the integrity of their monarchy, found themselves confronting a scandal that shook their faith in the very foundations of their government. In the bustling marketplace of Aurelius, vendors abandoned their usual cheerful banter as they huddled around radio broadcasts delivering the shocking details. Maria Santos, a flower seller who had operated her stall for 30 years, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to the report. She had named her youngest daughter Isabel in honor of the Queen, believing her to be a role model of grace and charitable spirit. "I don't understand," Maria said to her neighbor, Thomas the blacksmith. "Queen Isabel opened the new school in our district just last year. She held my grandson's hand and promised him that education would be his path to a better life. How could she have stolen money meant for children like him?" Thomas shook his head grimly, his weathered hands gripping his leather apron. "The radio says 4 million gold sovereigns, Maria." 4 million. That's more money than our entire district sees in a decade. And here we've been scraping together coppers to buy supplies for our children's classes. The betrayal felt personal to thousands of Valdorian families who had watched Queen Isabel champion their causes for 18 years. She had visited rural villages during harvest festivals, comforted families affected by natural disasters, and consistently advocated for policies that improved the lives of common citizens. The revelation that money donated in good faith for children's education had been systematically stolen felt like a betrayal of everything they had believed about their society. Meanwhile, in the elegant drawing rooms of Valdoria's nobility, a different conversation was taking place. Lady Catherine Worthington, whose family had donated over 200,000 gold sovereigns to various royal charities over the past decade, sat in stunned silence as her husband read the official royal proclamation aloud. "The damage to our family's reputation will be immense," Lord Worthington said, setting down the document with shaking hands. "We publicly endorsed these charitable initiatives. We encouraged our friends and business associates to donate. We hosted fundraising galas in our home with Queen Isabel as our honored guest." Lady Worthington stared out the window of their mansion at the perfectly manicured gardens that had been the setting for one of those charitable galas just 6 months earlier. She could still picture Queen Isabel standing on the terrace, eloquently describing the need for educational opportunities in rural communities, her passion and sincerity seeming absolutely genuine. "Catherine, we need to consider our position carefully," her husband continued. "If the investigation reveals that we should have detected the fraud, if they determine that wealthy donors had a responsibility to verify how their money was being used, we could face legal consequences ourselves." The aristocratic families who had supported Queen Isabel's causes found themselves in an impossible situation. Their generous donations, made with the best of intentions, had unknowingly funded criminal enterprises. Some began to question their own judgment and financial oversight. Others worried about their political connections and business relationships. A few started to distance themselves publicly from the scandal, issuing statements through their attorneys that emphasized their shock and cooperation with any investigations. At the royal palace, the daily operations continued under an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that seemed to permeate every corridor and chamber. The staff members who had served Queen Isabel directly found themselves under intense scrutiny from investigators, their loyalty and competence suddenly questioned after years of dedicated service. Lady Margaret Thornfield, Queen Isabel's former private secretary, sat in a small interrogation room in the palace's administrative wing, facing 3 stern investigators from the Royal Intelligence Service. Her hands trembled slightly as she answered questions about her 18-month tenure in the Queen's service, her knowledge of financial transactions, and her interactions with the individuals now suspected of orchestrating the massive fraud. "Lady Thornfield," said Chief Investigator James Morrison, a thin man with sharp eyes who had built his career on uncovering political corruption, "you were responsible for managing Queen Isabel's schedule and coordinating her meetings with charitable organization officials. Did you ever notice anything unusual about her interactions with Marcus Pemberton?" Margaret searched her memory carefully, knowing that her answer could affect not only her own future but potentially influence the investigation's direction. Mr. Pemberton was always very professional in his communications with Her Majesty. He provided detailed financial reports and seemed genuinely committed to the Foundation's educational mission. I never observed any behavior that raised concerns about his integrity. What about the frequency of their private meetings? Pressed investigator Morrison. Our records show that Queen Isabel met with Pemberton alone at least twice monthly for the past 2 years, often without other Foundation board members present. Margaret felt the implication behind the question like a physical weight. Her Majesty was deeply involved in all aspects of the Foundation's work. She insisted on understanding every detail of the projects she supported. The private meetings were her way of ensuring she could answer any questions from donors or the media with complete accuracy. The interrogation continued for 3 hours, covering every aspect of Margaret's service and her observations of the Queen's professional relationships. By the time she was dismissed, Margaret felt emotionally drained and uncertain about her own future in royal service. The investigation was clearly designed to determine not just who was guilty of fraud, but who might have been negligent in preventing it. Similar interrogations were taking place throughout the palace as investigators interviewed everyone from senior advisors to kitchen staff, building a comprehensive picture of how the charitable fraud had operated under the very roof of Valdoria's seat of power. The process was thorough, invasive, and deeply unsettling for people who had dedicated their careers to serving the crown with honor and discretion. In his private study, King Edmund struggled with the most difficult decision of his reign. The folder containing evidence of his wife's involvement lay open on his desk, its contents representing not just criminal activity but the destruction of everything he had believed about their partnership and marriage. Lord Chancellor Frederick Ashworth sat across from him, waiting for guidance on how to proceed with the complex legal and political challenges that lay ahead. Your Majesty, Lord Ashworth said quietly, the Parliament is requesting an emergency session to address the constitutional implications of this situation. Several members are questioning whether the monarchy's credibility can survive this scandal. Edmund rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of Valdorian royal tradition pressing down on his shoulders. His ancestors had faced wars, natural disasters, and political upheavals, but none had confronted a crisis that so directly challenged the moral authority of the crown itself. What are our options, Frederick? Edmund asked, though he suspected the choices were all variations of disaster. We can pursue a complete criminal investigation and prosecute everyone involved, including the former queen, to the fullest extent of the law, Lord Ashworth replied. This approach demonstrates that no one is above justice, but it could permanently damage the monarchy's reputation and provide ammunition for Republican movements that want to abolish the crown entirely. Edmund considered this option with a heavy heart. Prosecuting Isabel would mean watching the woman he had loved for 20 years face potential imprisonment, public humiliation, and the complete destruction of her reputation. It would also mean admitting to his people that he had been deceived for years by someone he trusted completely. The alternative, Lord Ashworth continued, is to negotiate a quiet resolution. The former queen could agree to permanent exile, full restitution of the stolen funds, and a public admission of responsibility without a lengthy trial. This approach might preserve some dignity for all parties involved and allow the monarchy to begin rebuilding its reputation more quickly. The second option offered practical advantages but felt like a betrayal of the principles Edmund had sworn to uphold when he became king. The people of Valdoria deserved justice, and the victims of the fraud deserved to see those responsible held accountable through the proper legal process. There's another complication, Lord Ashworth added reluctantly. Our intelligence service has received reports that neighboring kingdoms are watching this situation very closely. Some may view our internal crisis as an opportunity to challenge our territorial agreements or trade partnerships. We need to resolve this scandal quickly to prevent broader geopolitical consequences. Edmund walked to the window overlooking the palace grounds, where he could see gardeners continuing their daily maintenance of the royal gardens. The sight of normal activities continuing despite the crisis provided a small measure of comfort, reminding him that life would go on regardless of the decisions he made in the coming days. Scheduled a parliament session for tomorrow morning, he decided. I will address the nation directly about this scandal and outline our commitment to complete transparency in the investigation. The people of Valdoria deserve to hear the truth from their king, not from rumors and newspaper speculation. As Lord Ashworth departed to make the necessary arrangements, Edmund remained at the window, contemplating the irony of his situation. For 18 years, he and Isabel had worked together to strengthen Valdoria's institutions, improve its international standing, and build trust with their citizens. Now, in a single day, that work had been undone by revelations that called into question everything they had accomplished together. The telephone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. His private secretary informed him that his brother Prince Alexander was requesting an urgent meeting. Alexander had served as the kingdom's Minister of Foreign Affairs for 12 years and was one of the few people whose counsel Edmund trusted completely in personal matters. Prince Alexander arrived within minutes, his expression reflecting the gravity of the situation that now threatened their family's legacy. At 43, he was 2 years younger than Edmund but had always provided steady, practical advice during political crises. His diplomatic experience had taught him to assess complex situations objectively, even when personal emotions were involved. "Edmund," Prince Alexander said, settling into a chair near his brother's desk, "I've spent the morning consulting with our ambassadors and trade representatives. The international community is watching this scandal very closely. Our economic partnerships depend heavily on Valdoria's reputation for political stability and ethical governance." Edmund appreciated his brother's direct approach to the crisis, though the implications were sobering. How severe could the economic impact be? "Potentially devastating," Alexander replied bluntly. "The Eastern Trade Consortium has already postponed signing the textile agreements we negotiated last month. They want to see how this scandal resolves before committing to long-term partnerships with our kingdom. If other trading partners follow suit, we could face significant economic disruption." The cascade of consequences from Isabel's downfall seemed to expand with each passing hour. What had begun as a financial scandal was now threatening Valdoria's economic stability, political credibility, and international relationships. Edmund realized that his personal grief over his wife's betrayal was a luxury he could not afford while the kingdom's future hung in the balance. "Alexander, I need your honest assessment," Edmund said. "Can the monarchy survive this crisis?" Prince Alexander considered the question carefully before responding. "The institution can survive, but it will require decisive action, complete transparency, and probably significant reforms to our oversight procedures. The people need to see that we're taking responsibility for what happened and implementing changes to prevent similar scandals in the future." "What about Isabel? What do you think should happen to her?" The question hung in the air between the two brothers, carrying the weight of family loyalty, royal duty, and personal justice. Alexander had known Isabel for 20 years and had witnessed the genuine affection and partnership she had shared with Edmund. He had also seen her dedication to charitable work and her positive impact on thousands of Valdorian families. "She has to face the legal consequences of what happened," Alexander said finally. "Whether she knew about the fraud or not, her negligence enabled massive theft from charitable organizations. The people won't accept any resolution that appears to protect her from accountability because of her royal status." Edmund nodded, though accepting his brother's assessment felt like signing Isabel's death warrant. He knew that a criminal trial would destroy not just her reputation but any possibility of rebuilding their personal relationship, even if she were eventually cleared of intentional wrongdoing. As the afternoon progressed, reports continued to arrive at the palace providing additional details about the scope and sophistication of the charitable fraud. Investigators had discovered that the scheme involved at least 7 different organizations, multiple false identities, and bank accounts in 3 neighboring kingdoms. The complexity suggested that Marcus Pemberton had not acted alone but was part of a larger criminal network that had specifically targeted Valdorian royal charities because of their reputation and prestige. The revelation that Queen Isabel had been systematically deceived by professional criminals provided some context for understanding how the fraud had continued undetected for so long. However, it also raised uncomfortable questions about the royal family's oversight procedures and their ability to protect the kingdom's interests from sophisticated threats. By evening, Edmund faced the reality that his decision to strip Isabel of her titles and privileges had been only the beginning of a crisis that would test every aspect of his leadership and the monarchy's resilience. The woman he had loved and trusted was gone from his life, but the consequences of her downfall would continue to reverberate through the kingdom for months or years to come. The countryside estate of Victoria Montclair sat nestled among rolling hills covered in autumn foliage, its stone walls and ivy-covered facade offering a stark contrast to the marble grandeur of the royal palace. For Isabel, arriving at her sister's home felt like stepping into a different world, one where the weight of crowns and the burden of royal responsibility could not follow. Yet even in this peaceful setting, the reality of her situation cast a shadow over everything. Victoria greeted her sister at the front door with an embrace that spoke of years of shared memories and unconditional family loyalty. At 51, Victoria had chosen a life of quiet contentment over public service, managing her late husband's agricultural estate and raising 3 children who had grown up far from the complexities of royal politics. Her home represented everything that Isabel's life had not been: simple, private, and free from the constant scrutiny of public opinion. "Izzy," Victoria said, using the childhood nickname that no one else had been permitted to use for 20 years, "whatever has happened, whatever they're saying, you're my sister and you're welcome here for as long as you need." The guest bedroom Victoria had prepared overlooked a garden where roses still bloomed despite the advancing season. Isabel stood at the window, watching her sister's groundskeeper tend to the flower beds with the same careful attention she had once devoted to state documents and charitable initiatives. The simple routine of garden maintenance seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the chaos she had left behind at the palace. "The newspapers are already calling it the greatest royal scandal in 3 centuries, Victoria said gently, setting a cup of tea on the bedside table. "They're comparing it to the political upheavals that brought down monarchies in other kingdoms." Isabel turned from the window, her face showing the strain of the past 24 hours. She had slept little during her final night in the palace, spending most of the dark hours packing personal belongings and trying to process the magnitude of what had been revealed about the charitable foundation she had believed was her greatest accomplishment. "Victoria, I need you to understand something," Isabel said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even herself. "I may have been naive, and I certainly failed in my oversight responsibilities, but I did not knowingly participate in stealing money from children's education programs." Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, studying her sister's face with the insight that comes from decades of shared confidences. "I believe you, Izzy. I've watched you work with charitable organizations since we were teenagers volunteering at the local orphanage. Your commitment to helping others has always been genuine. But the evidence against me is overwhelming," Isabel continued. "My signature is on dozens of authorization documents. I personally appointed the people who orchestrated this fraud. I gave public endorsements that convinced families to donate money that was subsequently stolen." The weight of her culpability pressed down on Isabel like a physical burden. Even if she had been deceived, her position as royal patron meant that she bore responsibility for ensuring the integrity of the organizations she supported. The trust that thousands of families had placed in her charitable work had been betrayed, regardless of her intentions or knowledge. "What will you do now?" Victoria asked. Isabel moved to the writing desk by the window, where Victoria had thoughtfully placed writing materials and stationery. "I'm going to fight this, Victoria. I'm going to cooperate fully with the investigation and work to uncover exactly how this fraud was perpetrated. The people who donated money to these causes deserve to know the truth, and the children who were supposed to benefit from these programs deserve justice." The decision to actively participate in the investigation rather than simply enduring it represented a fundamental shift in Isabel's approach to her crisis. She had spent her royal career working within established systems and protocols, but now those same systems were examining her potential criminality. Fighting for her reputation and the truth would require her to think and act in ways she had never needed to consider during her 18 years as queen. Meanwhile, back in the capital city of Aurelius, King Edmund faced the most challenging speech of his reign. The parliament had convened an emergency session, and representatives from across the kingdom demanded answers about how such massive fraud could have occurred under the monarchy's supervision. The Grand Chamber buzzed with tension as elected officials, lords, and royal advisors gathered to hear their king address a crisis that threatened the very foundations of their governmental system. Edmund stood at the podium where his father had once delivered speeches about national unity during wartime, and his grandfather had announced territorial expansions that had increased Valdoria's prosperity. Today, he faced the much more difficult task of maintaining his people's faith in their institutions while acknowledging failures that had occurred under his own roof. "My fellow Valdorians," Edmund began, his voice carrying across the packed chamber, "I stand before you today to address a betrayal of trust that strikes at the heart of everything we hold sacred about public service and charitable responsibility." The silence in the chamber was complete as representatives leaned forward to catch every word of what many considered the most important royal speech in generations. "The evidence presented to me demonstrates that over the past 6 years, criminal conspirators systematically stole over 4 million gold sovereigns from charitable organizations operating under royal patronage. This money was donated by generous families who believed they were supporting education for our kingdom's children. Instead, their contributions were diverted to personal accounts and fraudulent enterprises." Murmurs rippled through the chamber as the king confirmed details that had been circulating in newspaper reports and public speculation. "I have ordered a complete investigation into these crimes, and I pledge to you that every person responsible for this fraud will be held accountable under our kingdom's laws, regardless of their position or previous service to the crown." The implicit reference to his wife's involvement hung in the air, though Edmund did not mention Isabel by name. Everyone in the chamber understood that the former queen's fate would depend on what the investigation revealed about her knowledge and participation in the fraudulent schemes. Furthermore, Edmund continued, "I am announcing immediate reforms to the oversight procedures governing all royal charitable activities. No single individual will have unilateral authority over fund allocation decisions. All financial transactions above 10,000 gold sovereigns will require approval from multiple board members and independent auditing. These changes will ensure that the trust our people place in royal charitable work is never again betrayed." The proposed reforms addressed systemic weaknesses that had allowed the fraud to continue undetected, but they also represented an acknowledgement that the monarchy's previous oversight had been inadequate. For an institution that prided itself on competence and reliability, this admission was particularly difficult. Lord William Hartfield, the leader of the parliamentary opposition, rose to address the king directly. "Your Majesty, while we appreciate your commitment to reform and accountability, many of our constituents are asking whether this scandal demonstrates fundamental problems with having an unelected monarchy overseeing public charitable activities." The question cut to the heart of the constitutional crisis that the fraud had created. If the royal family could not be trusted to manage charitable work effectively, what other aspects of governance might be susceptible to similar failures? "Lord Hartfield," Edmund replied carefully, "the failures revealed by this investigation reflect human weaknesses that can affect any institution, whether elected or hereditary. Our responsibility is not to defend past mistakes but to learn from them and build systems that better protect the public interest." The parliamentary session continued for over 3 hours, with representatives demanding details about the investigation timeline, the scope of financial losses, and the monarchy's plans for ensuring similar scandals would not occur in the future. Edmund answered each question directly, demonstrating a level of transparency that surprised many observers who had expected more traditional royal reserve. By the end of the session, it was clear that the monarchy's survival would depend on the investigation's findings and the public's assessment of how effectively the royal family responded to the crisis. The old assumptions about royal infallibility had been shattered, but the possibility remained for building new relationships based on accountability and earned trust. In a small apartment above a bookstore in the merchant district of Aurelius, Marcus Pemberton sat at his kitchen table reading newspaper accounts of the scandal that had destroyed the charitable foundation he had managed for 6 years. The man who had orchestrated the theft of over 4 million gold sovereigns appeared remarkably calm as he sipped coffee and studied the photographs of Queen Isabel being escorted from the palace. Pemberton's apartment was modest and unremarkable, the home of a successful but not wealthy professional who lived comfortably within his apparent means. Nothing in his surroundings suggested access to the millions he had stolen, nor did his appearance hint at the sophisticated criminal mind that had designed and executed such an elaborate fraud. His telephone rang, and Pemberton answered with the casual tone of someone expecting ordinary conversation rather than discussion of major criminal activity. "Marcus," said the voice on the other end, which belonged to Isabella Carstairs, the prominent donor who had unknowingly served as a front for several fraudulent transactions. "I've just spoken with my attorney. He says the investigation will certainly include questioning all major donors and board members." "I expected that," Pemberton replied calmly. We've been very careful to ensure that our activities would appear legitimate under scrutiny. The donation records are accurate, the construction projects were completed, and the financial documentation supports everything we reported to Queen Isabel." Isabella's voice carried a note of anxiety that contrasted sharply with Pemberton's composed demeanor. "But, Marcus, if they examine the bank records closely, won't they discover the shell companies and redirected funds?" "The bank accounts were established in jurisdictions with strong privacy laws," Pemberton explained. "Accessing those records will require diplomatic negotiations that could take months or years. By the time investigators piece together the complete financial picture, we'll have had ample opportunity to relocate our assets beyond their reach." The conversation revealed the sophisticated planning that had made the charitable fraud possible. Pemberton had not simply stolen money opportunistically, he had designed a system that could withstand initial scrutiny while providing multiple escape routes if the scheme were eventually discovered. "What about Queen Isabel?" Isabella asked. "Will she be able to prove her innocence?" Pemberton paused before answering, and, when he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "Her Majesty was the perfect victim for our purposes. Her genuine commitment to charitable work made her eager to trust people who shared her goals. Her royal status gave our organizations credibility that we could never have achieved independently. Unfortunately, her innocence will be very difficult to prove because we were so careful to involve her in every major decision." The irony was bitter. Queen Isabel's dedication to her charitable work had been exploited to facilitate the very crimes that had destroyed her life and reputation. Her trust in others and her desire to help disadvantaged children had been turned into weapons against her by people who understood how to manipulate her best qualities for criminal purposes. "Isabella," Pemberton continued, "the most important thing now is that we maintain our composure and continue to present ourselves as victims of this fraud rather than perpetrators. Our shock and cooperation with the investigation must appear completely genuine." As the conversation concluded, Pemberton returned to his newspaper reading, studying the photographs of the woman whose life he had destroyed through calculated deception. He felt no remorse for the theft itself. The money had been donated by wealthy families who could afford the loss. However, he had not anticipated the personal cost that Queen Isabel would pay for his crimes, nor had he fully considered how many innocent people would be affected by the scandal that followed the fraud's exposure. The investigation that would determine all their fates was just beginning, but Pemberton had already begun implementing the escape plans he had developed over years of careful preparation. The stolen millions were safely hidden beyond the immediate reach of Valdorian authorities, and he possessed multiple false identities that would allow him to disappear entirely if the investigation came too close to uncovering his true role in the conspiracy. Meanwhile, in a tavern near the docks where merchant sailors gathered to share news from neighboring kingdoms, rumors were already circulating about the political opportunities that Valdoria's crisis might create. Representatives from rival nations listened carefully to discussions about the monarchy's weakened position and the possibility that economic or territorial concessions might be extracted from a kingdom dealing with internal instability. The charitable fraud had consequences that reached far beyond the stolen money and damaged reputations. It had created vulnerabilities that enemies of the kingdom were eager to exploit, and it had set in motion political forces that would continue to affect Valdoria's destiny long after the investigation concluded. 3 weeks into the investigation, Chief Investigator James Morrison sat in his cramped office at Royal Intelligence Headquarters, surrounded by towers of financial documents, bank records, and witness testimonies that painted an increasingly complex picture of the charitable fraud. The case had evolved from what initially appeared to be simple embezzlement into something far more sophisticated and troubling, an organized conspiracy that had targeted the monarchy's charitable work specifically because of its prestige and lack of rigorous oversight. Morrison had spent 15 years investigating financial crimes, but the Valdorian charity scandal presented unique challenges that tested every aspect of his professional expertise. The criminals had exploited not just financial systems but social relationships, cultural expectations, and the public's trust in royal institutions. Unraveling their methods required understanding psychology as much as accounting. His latest breakthrough had come from an unexpected source, a former bookkeeper at Pemberton Construction Limited who had contacted the investigation team after reading newspaper accounts of Queen Isabel's banishment. Sarah Mitchell, a 43-year-old single mother who had worked for the construction company for 8 months before being dismissed, provided testimony that dramatically expanded investigators' understanding of the conspiracy's scope. Mr. Pemberton seemed like a normal employer when I started working there, Sarah had told Morrison during her interview the previous day. He was professional, paid fair wages, and the projects we were billing for seemed legitimate. It wasn't until I started noticing discrepancies in the expense reports that I realized something was wrong. Sarah explained that Pemberton Construction was billing Royal Charities for materials and labor costs that were significantly higher than what the company actually paid to suppliers and workers. The difference was being transferred to accounts that she was not permitted to access, despite her responsibility for maintaining the company's financial records. When I asked Mr. Pemberton about the discrepancies, he told me that the additional charges were administrative fees and consulting costs that were handled by his business partners, Sarah continued. He said the Royal Charities expected detailed billing but didn't require documentation for every administrative expense. The testimony revealed that Pemberton had created a systematic method for inflating construction costs while still delivering the promised schools and facilities. The buildings were real, the children were receiving education, and the visible results satisfied Queen Isabel's expectations. However, the projects were costing significantly more than necessary, with the excess funds being diverted to the conspirators. How much additional money was being charged per project? Morrison had asked. Based on what I could determine from the records I had access to, the Royal Charities were paying approximately 60% more than the actual construction costs, Sarah replied. For a project budgeted at 500,000 gold sovereigns, the real cost might have been only 300,000, with 200,000 being stolen through inflated billing. This revelation explained how such massive theft could occur while still producing tangible results that satisfied the charitable foundation's stated objectives. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity: deliver what was promised, but charge significantly more than necessary and pocket the difference. Morrison's investigation team had also uncovered evidence of international connections that suggested the Valdorian fraud was part of a larger criminal network operating across multiple kingdoms. Bank records showed wire transfers to accounts in the neighboring Kingdom of Astoria, the Merchant Republic of Salvana, and the Eastern Principalities. The amounts were structured to avoid triggering international banking oversight, but their frequency and destinations indicated sophisticated money laundering operations. The international scope of the conspiracy created diplomatic complications for King Edmund's government. Recovering the stolen funds would require cooperation from foreign governments that had their own political interests to consider. Some might be reluctant to assist an investigation that could expose similar vulnerabilities in their own charitable and financial systems. Meanwhile, at her sister's estate, Isabel had been working with her own legal team to prepare for what seemed inevitable criminal charges. Her attorney, Sir Richard Blackwood, was one of Valdoria's most respected criminal defense lawyers, but even his expertise could not eliminate the substantial evidence connecting her to the fraudulent activities. Your Majesty, Sir Richard said during their meeting in Victoria's parlor, I must be completely frank about your legal position. The prosecution will argue that your signatures on authorization documents demonstrate either criminal intent or such gross negligence that it constitutes criminal behavior. Isabel sat across from him at the polished wooden table where Victoria served afternoon tea to her children during their school holidays. The domestic setting provided a strange contrast to the legal conversation that would determine whether she spent the next several years in prison. What are our options for defense? Isabel asked, though she suspected the choices were limited. We can argue that you were a victim of sophisticated deception, that the criminals exploited your trust and dedication to charitable work, Sir Richard replied. We can present evidence of your genuine commitment to education and children's welfare. We can demonstrate that you received no personal benefit from the stolen funds. But the legal standard for criminal negligence does not require intent to harm, Sir Richard explained. If the prosecution can prove that a reasonable person in your position should have detected the fraud, they can argue that your failure to do so constitutes criminal behavior. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of the case and the various legal strategies available for her defense. By its conclusion, Isabel understood that her fate would depend largely on how the jury perceived her character and competence rather than on technical legal arguments. Sir Richard, regardless of the personal consequences, I want to cooperate fully with the investigation, Isabel decided. I want to help recover as much of the stolen money as possible and ensure that the real criminals are held accountable. The decision to cooperate rather than simply defending herself reflected Isabel's understanding that the scandal had consequences far beyond her personal situation. The families who had donated money deserved restitution, and the children who had been promised educational opportunities deserved justice. Back at the royal palace, King Edmund was grappling with decisions that would affect not only his relationship with Isabel but the monarchy's long-term credibility. Prince Alexander had presented him with intelligence reports suggesting that neighboring kingdoms were indeed viewing Valdoria's crisis as an opportunity to renegotiate trade agreements and territorial boundaries. The ambassador from Astoria has requested a meeting about adjusting our border arrangements in the northern provinces, Prince Alexander reported during their private consultation. The Eastern Trade Consortium is threatening to impose additional inspection requirements on our textile exports unless we can demonstrate improved oversight of our financial institutions. The international pressure created a timeline that was independent of the criminal investigation's natural progression. Edmund needed to restore confidence in his kingdom's governance quickly, or face economic and territorial losses that could affect Valdoria's prosperity for generations. What would our options be if we negotiated a settlement with Isabel rather than pursuing criminal charges? Edmund asked, though the question felt like a betrayal of everything he had promised about accountability and justice. Prince Alexander consulted his notes carefully before responding. A settlement could involve her accepting responsibility for the oversight failures, agreeing to permanent exile from royal duties, and committing to assist in recovering the stolen funds. In exchange, she would avoid criminal prosecution and potential imprisonment. And how would the public react to such an arrangement? Mixed reactions, I would expect, Alexander replied. Some would view it as appropriate mercy for someone who was deceived rather than criminal. Others would see it as special treatment for royalty that ordinary citizens wouldn't receive in similar circumstances. The dilemma represented one of the fundamental challenges of constitutional monarchy, balancing personal relationships with institutional responsibilities, and individual justice with broader political needs. Edmund's decision would establish precedents that would influence how future royal scandals were handled and how the public viewed the monarchy's commitment to equality under the law. That evening, Edmund made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than waiting for the investigation to conclude or negotiating a private settlement, he announced his intention to visit Isabel at her sister's estate for a personal conversation about their shared responsibilities and the kingdom's future. The announcement created immediate controversy among his political advisors, who worried about the appearance of the king consulting with someone under criminal investigation. However, Edmund felt that his 18-year partnership with Isabel, regardless of its legal complications, deserved a direct conversation about how to minimize the damage to Valdoria and its people. The drive to Victoria's estate took Edmund through countryside villages where he could see the impact of the scandal in the faces of citizens who gathered to watch his motorcade pass. Their expressions reflected confusion, disappointment, and uncertainty about the future of institutions they had trusted throughout their lives. The sight of farmers and shopkeepers wondering about the integrity of their government weighed heavily on Edmund's conscience. Victoria Montclair greeted the king at her front door with the complicated courtesy of someone welcoming a brother-in-law who had banished her sister from the family they had all shared. Her manner was respectful but notably cooler than their previous interactions during happier royal occasions. "Your Majesty," Victoria said, "Isabel is in the garden. She's been spending most of her time there, thinking about everything that has happened." Edmund found his wife sitting on a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its autumn leaves creating a golden canopy above her. She wore a simple dress and cardigan that emphasized how dramatically her circumstances had changed from the elaborate gowns and jewelry of royal life. When she looked up at his approach, he saw that she had been crying, though her expression showed determination as well as sadness. "Edmund," she said, rising to greet him with the formal curtsy that their new relationship seemed to require. "Isabel," he replied, and, for a moment, neither of them knew how to proceed with a conversation that carried the weight of their destroyed marriage, her legal jeopardy, and the kingdom's political crisis. "I want to talk about the investigation," Edmund said finally. I want to understand what you remember about the decisions that led to this situation, and I want to discuss how we can work together to minimize the damage to Valdoria. They sat together on the bench where Victoria's children had played during countless family gatherings, and, for the next 3 hours, they discussed every aspect of the charitable foundation's operations, Isabel's interactions with the suspected criminals, and her willingness to assist in the investigation despite the personal costs. I trusted Marcus Pemberton because he produced results, Isabel explained. The schools were built on schedule, the teachers were hired and paid, and the children were receiving quality education. I never had reason to question whether the projects were costing more than necessary. What about the financial reports he provided? Edmund asked. Did anything seem unusual about the numbers or the explanations? Isabel considered the question carefully, searching her memory for details that might have indicated problems with Pemberton's management of the foundation's funds. The reports were always very detailed and professional, she replied. He provided photographs of construction progress, testimonials from teachers and parents, and financial breakdowns that appeared thorough and reasonable. If there were discrepancies, they were hidden in ways that I didn't have the expertise to detect. The conversation revealed the fundamental vulnerability that had made the fraud possible, the separation between charitable objectives and financial oversight that had allowed criminals to manipulate systems designed to trust rather than verify. Isabel's focus on educational outcomes had prevented her from developing the financial expertise necessary to detect sophisticated accounting fraud. As the afternoon progressed, Edmund and Isabel began to develop a plan for her cooperation with the investigation that would maximize the chances of recovering stolen funds and prosecuting the real criminals while also considering the political needs of the kingdom. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Investigator Morrison, who had driven to the estate to inform Isabel that Marcus Pemberton had been arrested attempting to cross the border into Astoria with false identification documents and over 200,000 gold sovereigns in various currencies. The arrest represented a major breakthrough in the investigation, but it also meant that Isabel's own legal jeopardy had intensified significantly. Pemberton would likely negotiate a plea agreement that could implicate her in exchange for reduced charges, regardless of her actual knowledge of or participation in the fraud. The arrest of Marcus Pemberton sent shockwaves through the investigation that reverberated far beyond the walls of his holding cell in the Royal Detention Center. Within hours of his capture at the Asturian border, news of his attempted escape with substantial amounts of cash had reached every newspaper in Valdoria and beyond. The dramatic circumstances of his arrest transformed public perception of the scandal from a story about royal oversight failures into a tale of international criminal conspiracy and attempted flight from justice. Pemberton's detention cell was spartanly furnished with a narrow bed, wooden desk, and single window that offered a view of the center's courtyard. Despite his circumstances, he maintained the same composed demeanor that had served him well during 6 years of systematic fraud. When Chief Investigator Morrison arrived for the first formal interrogation, Pemberton greeted him with the polite professionalism of someone attending a business meeting rather than facing potential life imprisonment. "Mr. Pemberton," Morrison began, setting a thick folder of evidence on the metal table between them, "you were arrested with false identification documents and 247,000 gold sovereigns in various currencies. How do you explain possessing such substantial amounts of cash?" Pemberton adjusted his prison uniform and met Morrison's gaze directly. "The money represents savings accumulated over several years of legitimate business activities. The identification documents were obtained for personal security reasons, given the threats I've received since this investigation became public knowledge." The explanation was carefully crafted to sound reasonable while avoiding any admission of criminal activity. Morrison had questioned hundreds of suspects during his career, and he recognized the practiced responses of someone who had anticipated this conversation and prepared accordingly. "Mr. Pemberton, our financial investigation has traced over 4.2 million gold sovereigns in fraudulent transactions connected to charitable organizations under your management. We have bank records, witness testimony, and documentation that demonstrates systematic theft over a period of 6 years." Morrison opened his folder and began placing evidence on the table: bank transfer records showing funds being diverted from construction accounts, testimony from Sarah Mitchell about inflated billing practices, and correspondence between Pemberton and shell companies in multiple jurisdictions. For the first time since his arrest, Pemberton's composed expression showed a flicker of concern. the scope and detail of the evidence clearly exceeded what he had anticipated the investigation might uncover in such a short time period. "I want to speak with my attorney before answering any additional questions," Pemberton said, invoking his legal right to representation. "Of course," Morrison replied. "However, I should inform you that we're prepared to offer significant considerations for cooperation in recovering stolen funds and providing information about other individuals involved in this conspiracy." The offer of plea negotiations represented Morrison's assessment that Pemberton was not the mastermind of the fraud but rather a key participant in a larger criminal network. Recovering the stolen money and identifying other conspirators was more important than maximizing Pemberton's individual punishment. Meanwhile, at the royal palace, King Edmund convened an emergency cabinet meeting to address the political crisis that Pemberton's arrest had created. The attempted escape confirmed public suspicions that the charitable fraud was part of an organized criminal conspiracy, which simultaneously vindicated the monarchy's claims of victimization and raised new questions about their security and oversight procedures. "Your Majesty," said Lord Chancellor Frederick Ashworth, "Pemberton's arrest has created an opportunity to demonstrate decisive action against the criminals responsible for this fraud. The public wants to see justice served, and this arrest provides tangible evidence that we're holding wrongdoers accountable." Minister of Justice Eleanor Whitman disagreed with Ashworth's optimistic assessment. "The arrest also raises questions about why our intelligence services failed to detect this conspiracy earlier, and why someone with access to royal charitable funds was able to accumulate false identification documents and substantial cash reserves without triggering any security alerts." The cabinet discussion revealed the complex political calculations surrounding every aspect of the scandal's resolution. Each development could be interpreted either as evidence of effective governance and law enforcement or as proof of systemic failures that required more fundamental reforms. "What about the international implications?" asked Prince Alexander, who had been monitoring diplomatic communications since Pemberton's arrest. "The Asturian government is demanding explanations for why a Valdorian criminal was attempting to enter their kingdom with substantial amounts of cash and false documents. The diplomatic complications threaten to extend the crisis beyond Valdoria's borders and potentially strain relationships with neighboring kingdoms that were essential for trade and security cooperation." Edmund realized that resolving the domestic scandal was only part of the challenge facing his government. "We need to provide complete transparency to our allies about this investigation," Edmund decided. "We cannot appear to be hiding information or attempting to minimize the scope of criminal activity that originated in our kingdom." At Victoria's estate, Isabel learned of Pemberton's arrest through a phone call from her attorney, Sir Richard Blackwood. The news brought mixed emotions: relief that one of the primary criminals was in custody, but anxiety about what his testimony might reveal about her own role in the charitable foundation's operations. "The arrest strengthens our defense argument that you were a victim of sophisticated deception," Sir Richard explained during their telephone conversation. "However, the prosecution will likely pressure Pemberton to implicate you in exchange for reduced charges." Isabel sat in Victoria's study, surrounded by law books and legal documents that had become the instruments of her fight for exoneration. The room where her sister had once helped their children with homework had been transformed into a legal war room where the battle for Isabel's freedom and reputation was being planned. "Sir Richard, I want to make a formal offer to testify against Pemberton and any other conspirators in exchange for immunity from prosecution," Isabel decided. "I'm willing to admit my oversight failures and accept responsibility for not detecting the fraud, but I want the opportunity to help ensure the real criminals face appropriate punishment." The decision represented a significant strategic shift in her legal approach. Rather than simply defending herself against criminal charges, she was offering to become an active participant in prosecuting the conspiracy that had destroyed her life and reputation. "Your Majesty, such an arrangement would require negotiations with the prosecution and approval from King Edmund himself," Sir Richard warned. "You would be admitting to failures that could have civil liability implications and would permanently damage your reputation." "My reputation is already destroyed," Isabel replied pragmatically. "The question now is whether I can contribute to justice for the victims of this fraud and help prevent similar crimes in the future." Over the following week, negotiations between Isabel's legal team and the Royal Prosecution Service resulted in an unprecedented agreement that reflected the unique constitutional issues surrounding the case. Isabel would provide complete testimony about her interactions with the suspected criminals, assist in efforts to recover stolen funds, and accept formal responsibility for oversight failures that enabled the fraud. In exchange, she would avoid criminal prosecution while accepting permanent banishment from royal duties and agreeing to substantial financial penalties. The agreement required King Edmund's personal approval, forcing him to make a decision that balanced legal justice with political pragmatism and personal mercy. His choice would establish precedents for how future royal legal issues would be handled and would significantly influence public perceptions of the monarchy's relationship with the law. When Edmund announced his approval of the agreement during a televised address to the nation, his words carried the weight of 18 years of marriage and partnership as well as the authority of 3 centuries of royal tradition. The person who was once my queen has agreed to accept full responsibility for the oversight failures that enabled this fraud, Edmund said, speaking from the blue drawing room where Isabel's royal life had ended weeks earlier. While she did not personally benefit from or knowingly participate in these crimes, her failure to detect and prevent them represents a serious breach of the trust that our people placed in royal charitable institutions. The king's announcement satisfied neither those who demanded Isabel's imprisonment nor those who believed she deserved complete exoneration. However, it provided a resolution that allowed the investigation to focus on pursuing the actual criminals while beginning the process of rebuilding public trust in royal institutions. The trial of Marcus Pemberton and his co-conspirators began 3 months later in the Royal Court of Justice, with Isabel serving as a key prosecution witness. Her testimony, delivered over 2 days of intense questioning, provided detailed insights into how sophisticated criminals had exploited her trust and the charitable foundation's procedures to facilitate massive theft. I believe that Mr. Pemberton shared my commitment to improving educational opportunities for disadvantaged children, Isabel testified. He provided convincing evidence of successful projects, maintained professional relationships with other board members, and consistently demonstrated apparent competence in financial management. Under cross-examination by Pemberton's defense attorney, Isabel acknowledged her failures while maintaining her innocence of intentional wrongdoing. Did you ever verify the actual costs of construction projects by consulting with independent contractors? The defense attorney asked. No, Isabel admitted. I trusted the financial reports provided by the foundation's management and focused my attention on educational outcomes rather than detailed financial oversight. Did you ever visit construction sites during the building process to observe work in progress? I visited completed facilities and met with teachers and students, but I did not monitor day-to-day construction activities. The testimony revealed the systematic vulnerabilities that had made the fraud possible: excessive trust in appointed officials, inadequate independent verification of financial information, and separation between charitable objectives and financial oversight that created opportunities for exploitation. When the trial concluded after 6 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, Marcus Pemberton was convicted on 14 counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He received a sentence of 22 years in prison and was ordered to pay complete restitution to the victims of his crimes. His co-conspirators, including Isabella Carstairs, received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. The convictions provided some measure of justice for the families who had donated money to charitable causes and for the children whose educational opportunities had been compromised by the fraud. However, the recovered funds totaled only 1.8 million gold sovereigns of the 4.2 million that had been stolen, leaving substantial losses that would affect charitable work in Valdoria for years to come. 6 months after the trial's conclusion, King Edmund stood in the same blue drawing room where he had ended Isabel's royal life, reviewing reports on the reforms that had been implemented to prevent similar scandals. The room had been redecorated to remove reminders of the painful decisions made there, but the memories of those conversations continued to influence every aspect of his reign. The new oversight procedures required multiple approvals for significant financial decisions, independent auditing of all royal charitable activities, and regular rotation of key financial personnel to prevent the development of comfortable relationships that could facilitate fraud. The reforms had restored some public confidence in royal institutions, though polls showed that trust remained significantly lower than before the scandal. Prince Alexander entered the room carrying diplomatic correspondence that would require the king's attention. Edmund, we've received the final report on asset recovery efforts from the International Investigation Team. They've located an additional 400,000 gold sovereigns in accounts controlled by the conspiracy, but recovery will require lengthy legal proceedings in multiple jurisdictions. The report represented both progress and frustration, evidence that the investigation had been thorough and effective, but confirmation that complete justice for the victims would take years to achieve and might never be fully realized.
Any word from Isabel? Edmund asked, though he already knew the answer.
She's been working with a rural literacy program in the eastern provinces, Alexander replied.
Teaching reading to children in farming communities.
The work doesn't have royal patronage, but apparently she's found ways to contribute to education without the resources and authority she once possessed. The news that Isabel had found purpose in continuing the charitable work that had once defined her royal life provided Edmund with complicated emotions. He felt glad that she was helping children and proud that she had chosen service over self-pity. At the same time, her dedication to the same causes that had led to their separation served as a painful reminder of everything they had lost. As Edmund returned to the documents requiring his attention, he reflected on the irony of his situation. The reforms implemented after the scandal had made royal charitable work more secure and accountable than ever before. The procedures designed to prevent future fraud were comprehensive and effective. However, the personal cost of achieving these improvements had been the destruction of his marriage and the loss of the partner who had shared his commitment to serving their people. The kingdom of Valdoria had emerged stronger from its greatest scandal, but King Edmund ruled alone over institutions that had been purchased with the price of love, trust, and the dreams he had shared with someone who could never again be part of his world. The crown had survived, but everything else had been forever changed by decisions made in pursuit of justice and the protection of a realm that demanded sacrifices greater than any individual heart could willingly bear.